In a story filled with love, pain, and unwavering strength, Juan Pablo, a man known for his physical and moral fortitude, faces the most challenging battle of his life when he discovers his daughter, Rosalinda, in tears and bruised, kneeling on the floor of her home. A devoted father who had lost his wife years earlier, Juan Pablo had poured all his love into raising Rosalinda, only to find that the man he entrusted with her happiness, Esteban, had betrayed that trust most unforgivably. With emotions running high, Juan Pablo confronts the man who dared to harm his daughter, leading to a shocking and intense showdown that shakes the very foundations of their lives. Through the storm of anger and heartbreak, a father's love prevails, and together with Rosalinda, they begin the journey of healing and rebuilding, proving that the strength of family can overcome even the darkest of times. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Before we dive into this story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. As he crossed the threshold into his son-in-law's home, Juan Pablo was met with a sight that shattered his heart. His beloved daughter, Rosalinda, was on her hands and knees, scrubbing the floor with tears cascading down her cheeks, her sobs filling the quiet room. The anguish on her face was a dagger to his soul, slicing through his very being. The scene was a stark contrast to the vibrant and joyful girl he had raised, and what he did next left everyone who witnessed it in complete disbelief. Juan Pablo was a man whose presence commanded respect, not just for his formidable physical strength, which had been honed through years of grueling labor, but also for the unwavering strength of his character. He was the embodiment of resilience, a man who had weathered life's storms with a steadfast spirit. Born into a modest family in a small, close-knit rural village, Juan Pablo had learned the value of hard work at a tender age. The endless rows of cornfields surrounding his childhood home became both his playground and his training ground, where he worked alongside his father under the relentless sun. The lessons learned in those fields, lessons of perseverance, humility, and the importance of family, were etched into his very being, shaping him into the man he would become. His life was one of relentless toil, but Juan Pablo never complained. He wore his calloused hands and sun-weathered skin as badges of honor, symbols of the life he had built through sheer determination and hard work. The community revered him, seeing in him a rock of stability, a man who could be depended upon in times of need. Neighbors sought his advice, respected his judgment, and admired his dedication to his family. Yet, for all his strength and resolve, Juan Pablo's heart was tender, especially when it came to his daughter, Rosalinda. Many years before, fate had brought him together with Maria, a woman whose light could not be dimmed even by the harsh realities of life. She was a beacon of warmth and joy, her laughter a melody that seemed to make the world a better place. Their meeting was a moment of serendipity, a chance encounters that quickly blossomed into a love so deep, so profound, that it seemed as though the universe itself had conspired to bring them together. In no time they were married, and together they built a small home, a simple, modest structure that nevertheless overflowed with love, laughter, and the promise of a bright future. It was within the walls of this humble abode that Maria gave birth to Rosalinda, a child who inherited her mother's luminous spirit. From the moment she came into the world, Rosalinda was the center of Juan Pablo's universe. Her every smile, every giggle, was a balm to his weary soul, and he adored her with a love that was fierce and all-encompassing. Rosalinda was the apple of his eye, his pride and joy, and the reason he pushed himself harder each day. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 1 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. But life, as it often does, took a cruel turn. Maria, the light of Juan Pablo's life, fell gravely ill. The vibrant woman who had once filled their home with laughter was now a shadow of her former self, weakened by a relentless illness that refused to yield. Juan Pablo was devastated, but he refused to give in to despair. He poured every ounce of his strength, every bit of his savings into finding a cure, seeking out the best doctors and treatments he could afford. He clung to hope with all his might, desperate to save the woman he loved more than life itself. Despite his valiant efforts, Maria's illness proved to be merciless. Her condition deteriorated, and eventually she succumbed to the disease, leaving Juan Pablo and Rosalinda alone in a world that suddenly seemed much colder, much darker. The loss of Maria was a blow that nearly broke him. The void she left behind was immense, an emptiness that echoed through the halls of their once joyful home. Rosalinda, too young to fully comprehend the magnitude of the loss, could only cry in confusion and sorrow, her little heart aching for the mother she would never see again. In the aftermath of Maria's death, Juan Pablo made a solemn vow. He would devote his life to raising Rosalinda, to giving her the best life possible, despite the immense void left by her mother's absence. He became both father and mother to her, pouring all of his love, all of his energy, into ensuring she grew up surrounded by care and protection. He worked tirelessly, often late into the night, driven by the promise he had made to Maria on her deathbed that their daughter would know a life filled with love, opportunity, and happiness. Years passed, and Juan Pablo watched with a mixture of pride and bittersweet sorrow as Rosalinda blossomed into a beautiful young woman. She had inherited not only her mother's striking beauty but also her warm, generous spirit. Rosalinda was kind, compassionate, and strong, everything he had hoped she would be. Yet, with each passing day, Juan Pablo became increasingly aware that his little girl was no longer a child. She was growing up, and he knew that one day she would find someone to share her life with, just as he had found Maria all those years ago. This realization filled him with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he was overjoyed to see Rosalinda becoming a woman of such strength and grace, ready to take on the world with the same determination that had defined his own life. On the other hand, the thought of losing her, of her no longer being the center of his world, brought a deep ache to his heart. He could only hope and pray that when that day came, the man she chose would be worthy of her, someone who would cherish her as deeply as he did. And now, as he stood there, witnessing the heartbreaking scene of his daughter in tears, kneeling on the floor of her own home, the fear that she had given her heart to someone unworthy burned within him. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each more painful than the last. The strong, unshakable Juan Pablo felt a surge of emotion that was as powerful as any storm. What he did next would not only surprise everyone present, but would also change the course of his and Rosalinda's lives forever. That was when Esteban entered Rosalinda's life, a man who, at first glance, seemed to be everything Juan Pablo could have ever wished for his beloved daughter. Esteban exuded charm and politeness, always presenting himself as a hard-working and respectful man. He treated Rosalinda with a tenderness that quickly won over not only her heart, but also Juan Pablo's trust. The bond between Rosalinda and Esteban deepened swiftly, blossoming into a relationship that soon became serious and full of promise. As a father, Juan Pablo naturally harbored some apprehensions. After all, who could ever be good enough for his precious Rosalinda? Yet, try as he might, he found no reason to question Esteban's intentions. The young man had proven himself to be courteous, reliable, and genuinely affectionate towards Rosalinda. When the day of the wedding arrived, it was a simple but deeply emotional affair. The entire community gathered to witness their union, and Juan Pablo watched with a mix of pride and bittersweet sadness as his daughter walked down the aisle. Though a part of him ached at the thought of her no longer being solely under his care, he consoled himself with the belief that Esteban would be the man to make her happy, to cherish and protect her just as he always had. The first few months of their marriage seemed idyllic. Rosalinda, glowing with newlywed happiness, would often visit her father, her radiant smile reassuring Juan Pablo that he had made the right choice in supporting her marriage. Each time he saw her, his heart swelled with joy, convinced that she was living the life he had always hoped for. However, as the seasons changed, so too did something in Rosalinda. The vibrant spark that had always defined her began to fade. She became more subdued, her once bright eyes now shadowed by an unspoken sorrow. Whenever Juan Pablo inquired about her well-being, Rosalinda would offer a gentle smile and dismiss his concerns, attributing her weariness to the demands of adjusting to married life. She assured him repeatedly that everything was fine and that there was no need to worry. But the father in him could sense that something was amiss. Though he wanted to respect her autonomy and the sanctity of her marriage, a growing unease gnawed at him, a relentless whisper in his heart that something was wrong. Days turned into weeks, and Juan Pablo could no longer ignore the quiet desperation he saw in his daughter's eyes. He noticed how she seemed to withdraw from the world, how her once frequent visits became fewer and further between. The joy that had once radiated from her now seemed dimmed, like a candle flickering in the wind. Despite Rosalinda's reassurances, the unsettling feeling in Juan Pablo's gut only grew stronger. He felt a deep, instinctual need to be more present, to ensure that his daughter was truly all right. It was on an otherwise ordinary day, with nothing remarkable to distinguish it, that Juan Pablo decided to visit Rosalinda without any prior notice. Something compelled him. Perhaps it was the sleepless nights spent worrying or the gut-wrenching fear that he had been ignoring the signs for too long. As he approached his daughter's home, an inexplicable chill ran down his spine, a foreboding sensation that something was wrong. The house was unnervingly quiet, devoid of the usual sounds that filled it. No laughter, no humming, no trace of the life that had once animated the space. As he walked through the door, Juan Pablo's heart pounded in his chest, a primal fear taking hold of him. He moved through the house with silent steps, his senses on high alert, until he reached the kitchen. What he saw there made his breath catch in his throat, his heart lurching with a mixture of fury and despair. Rosalinda was on her knees, scrubbing the kitchen floor with a rag that moved almost mechanically in her hand. But it was not the act of cleaning that struck Juan Pablo. It was the expression of utter devastation on her face, the silent tears that streamed down her cheeks and dripped onto the spotless floor. This was not the vibrant, joyful daughter he had raised. This was a woman broken, crushed under the weight of an invisible burden. At that moment, Juan Pablo felt an overwhelming surge of emotions: anger, pain, helplessness, all crashing over him like a tidal wave. His blood boiled at the sight of his daughter in such a state no father should ever witness. The image of Rosalinda, his precious girl, reduced to this, was more than he could bear. His hands trembled with the urge to take action, to do something, anything, to erase the pain etched on her face. Without saying a word, Juan Pablo stepped forward, his mind racing with questions, his heart heavy with the realization that he had been blind to his daughter's suffering. The man who had vowed to protect her, to keep her safe from harm, was now confronted with the harsh truth that he had somehow failed her. Esteban, the man he had trusted with Rosalinda's happiness, now stood at the center of a storm that threatened to destroy everything Juan Pablo had fought to build for his daughter. As he stood there, watching Rosalinda cry in silence, Juan Pablo made a silent vow. Whatever had caused this pain, whatever had led his daughter to this moment of despair, would be confronted and rectified. The fierce protector in him awakened, and in that instant he knew that he would not rest until Rosalinda was safe, until she was free from whatever darkness had crept into her life. And so, with resolve hardening in his heart, Juan Pablo prepared to do what needed to be done, no matter the cost, no matter the consequences. Rosalinda, Juan Pablo's voice rang out, laden with concern and urgency. The sound of his voice made his daughter look up, and the sight of her face sent a jolt of pain through his heart, deeper than anything he had ever felt before. Her attempt at a smile, though weak and filled with sorrow, only made the ache more profound. At that moment, no words were needed. Juan Pablo could see in her eyes that something unspeakable had occurred. With a swift and instinctive movement, He dropped to his knees beside her, gathering her trembling form into his strong arms, holding her as if he could shield her from the pain she had endured. Her fragile body shook against his, and he could feel her sobs, raw and unrestrained, echoing through him. "My daughter, what happened?" he whispered, his voice strained with the effort to remain calm, though he could already feel a storm of anger and worry brewing within him. For a moment, Rosalinda said nothing, her sobs choking the words that struggled to escape her lips. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, she managed to quiet her sobs long enough to speak, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "Dad, I didn't want you to see me like this," she murmured, her words filled with a pain that tore at Juan Pablo's soul. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 2 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. He pulled back slightly, just enough to look at her face more closely, and that was when he saw it, the unmistakable, cruel bruise marring her delicate skin, a dark purple blotch near her left eye. It was the evidence of violence, a harsh and unforgiving mark that spoke volumes without her having to say a word. Shock and disbelief surged through Juan Pablo like a bolt of lightning, electrifying every nerve in his body. His fists clenched involuntarily, and he had to fight to keep the rage within him from exploding outward. "Rosalinda, who did this to you?" he demanded, his voice deep and trembling, thick with an emotion so fierce he barely recognized it as his own. His daughter's eyes lowered, her tears now falling silently onto the cleaning cloth still clutched in her hands. "It was Esteban," she whispered, her voice so small, as if the mere act of saying his name was too painful to bear. Juan Pablo felt the ground shift beneath him as if the very foundation of his world had been ripped away. Esteban, the man he had welcomed into his family, the man he had believed would care for and cherish his daughter, had done this. The fury that rose within him was like nothing he had ever experienced, an uncontrollable force driven by his instinct to protect his child. "He did this to you." Juan Pablo's voice was low and dangerous, more of a statement than a question, as if saying it aloud would make the reality of it all the more unbearable. Rosalinda nodded, her silent confirmation driving the truth deep into his heart like a dagger. "Why? What happened, my daughter? Tell me everything," he urged, desperate to understand, to know every detail of how this could have come to pass. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Rosalinda began to speak, her voice trembling with the weight of the memories. "It was because of a fight," she began, her eyes distant, as if she were reliving the nightmare in her mind. "He wanted to go out drinking with his friends like he always does. But today I asked him to stay home. I just wanted us to spend some time together, just the two of us. He's been going out so much lately, and I've been feeling so lonely." Juan Pablo listened in silence, his heart breaking anew with each word. The anger within him grew with every sentence, but he remained silent, letting Rosalinda continue. "I insisted." She went on, her voice barely above a whisper now. "I told him I was worried, that he was drinking too much, and that it was changing him, changing who he was. He didn't like that, Dad. He got so angry, he started yelling, saying I had no right to tell him what to do. I tried to calm him down and tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen. He pushed me against the wall and then he hit me." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, heavy and oppressive. Juan Pablo could barely breathe, the rage and helplessness almost choking him. How could Esteban do this? How could the man who had vowed to love and protect his daughter strike her with such cruelty? "After he hit me, I fell to the floor," Rosalinda continued, her voice trembling with the memory. "He looked at me with so much hatred, Dad. I've never seen him like that before. And then, without saying anything, he just left. He slammed the door behind him, and then there was silence. I stayed here, on the floor, not knowing what to do. I just started cleaning because I didn't want you to see the house like this. I didn't want you to know." As she spoke, Juan Pablo's mind raced. He could barely comprehend the depth of her pain, the betrayal she must have felt. The man he had trusted with his daughter's happiness had not only failed her but had become the source of her suffering. The thought of Rosalinda enduring this alone, afraid to reach out, was almost too much to bear. His heart ached with profound sorrow, but more than that, it burned with a fierce, protective anger. Esteban had not just hurt his daughter, he had crossed a line that no man should ever cross. Juan Pablo knew, at that moment, that things could never be the same. He had to do something, anything, to protect Rosalinda, to ensure that this would never happen again. His love for her, his duty as her father, demanded it. And so, with a heart heavy with the weight of his decision, he made a silent vow to himself he would confront Esteban, and he would make sure that his daughter was never put in harm's way again. No matter what it took, no matter what had to be done, Juan Pablo would see to it that Rosalinda was safe, that she could find peace once more. Juan Pablo felt the sting of tears threatening to spill, but he forced them back, knowing that this was not the time for weakness. He needed to be the pillar of strength Rosalinda could lean on, the protector he had always promised to be. Drawing her into his arms once more, he hugged her tightly, trying to infuse all his love, all his determination to shield her from any further harm, into that embrace. "Rosalinda, my precious daughter," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "you have nothing to fear. I'm here now, and I swear to you, this man, this monster, will never lay a hand on you again. I promise you that." He kissed her forehead, feeling the chill of her skin against his lips, a stark reminder of the pain she had endured. For a long moment he simply held her, both of them drawing strength from each other. But Juan Pablo knew that comfort alone would not be enough. Action was needed, and he was resolved to take it. Pulling back slightly, he searched Rosalinda's eyes, his own filled with fierce determination. "Where is Esteban now?" he asked, his voice low but steady, already bracing himself for the answer. Rosalinda, her voice still trembling with fear, replied softly, "He went to the bar, where he always goes with his friends." The mention of the bar ignited a fresh wave of anger in Juan Pablo, but he kept it in check. Standing up, he gently helped Rosalinda to her feet, his hands lingering on her shoulders, as if reluctant to let go. "Stay here, my daughter. I will return soon," he told her, his tone firm yet tender. He grabbed his hat from where it lay near the entrance, his movements sharp and purposeful. Without another word, he stepped out of the house, his mind set on one thing: confronting Esteban. As Juan Pablo walked away from his home, his steps were quick and resolute, fueled by the storm of emotions swirling inside him: anger, sorrow, and an unyielding need to protect his daughter. The familiar streets of the town seemed longer and more desolate than ever, each step taking him closer to the confrontation that he knew was inevitable. The image of Rosalinda, bruised and broken, haunted him with every stride, feeding the flames of his fury. He could feel the rage coursing through his veins, hot and volatile, ready to erupt the moment he laid eyes on Esteban. The bar was not far. Just a few blocks away, a small, unassuming place with wide doors and dim lighting, a refuge for the town's men after a long day of labor. To Juan Pablo, it had always been just another place where tired souls sought solace in a drink and idle conversation. But today, it had become something else entirely: a battleground where he would face the man who had dared to harm his daughter. As he approached, the sounds of laughter and chatter drifted out, mingling with the clinking of glasses, a stark contrast to the dark purpose that had brought him there. With a forceful push, Juan Pablo swung open the wooden doors, stepping inside with an air of grim resolve that immediately drew the attention of those closest to the entrance. The lively buzz of conversation died down as the patrons turned to see the stern figure that had just entered. Ignoring the curious and concerned glances thrown his way, Juan Pablo scanned the room, his eyes narrowing as they settled on Esteban, seated at a corner table, a glass of liquor in hand, and a carefree smile on his face, oblivious to the storm about to descend upon him. Juan Pablo wasted no time. With long, purposeful strides, he made his way across the room, the crowd parting before him, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Esteban looked up as Juan Pablo neared, his smile faltering only slightly as he registered his father-in-law's serious expression. Still unaware of the full weight of what was happening, he attempted to make light of the situation. "Do you need something, father-in-law?" he quipped, his voice laced with the casual arrogance of someone who felt untouchable. But there was no room for jokes, no space for pretense. The fury that Juan Pablo had been holding back now simmered just below the surface, barely contained. He stared down at Esteban, his eyes blazing with a righteous anger that left no doubt about his intentions. "Stand up," Juan Pablo commanded, his voice low and cold, the kind of tone that brooked no argument. The entire bar had fallen silent, every eye in the room fixed on the unfolding scene, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Esteban's smile vanished as he realized the seriousness of the situation. He hesitated for a moment, but Juan Pablo's unwavering gaze left him no choice. Slowly, he got to his feet, the confidence he had displayed just moments before now replaced by uncertainty. The air between them crackled with the intensity of the confrontation to come. "What you did to Rosalinda," Juan Pablo began, his voice trembling with controlled rage, ... was unforgivable. Each word was like a stone being laid down, building a wall between the man Esteban had pretended to be and the monster he had revealed himself as. "You raised your hand against my daughter, Juan Pablo's voice rose, the pain and anger finally breaking free from the constraints he had tried to impose on them. Esteban opened his mouth to respond, perhaps to justify, perhaps to deny, but Juan Pablo silenced him with a single, powerful motion, a hand raised, not to strike, but to signal that there would be no more lies, no more excuses. "You don't deserve to say her name," Juan Pablo spat, his voice filled with disgust. "You've shown me the kind of man you are, and I will not let you continue to hurt her." The room was so quiet that the sound of Esteban swallowing was audible, a clear sign of the fear that now gripped him. Juan Pablo took a step closer, his presence looming over Esteban like a dark cloud ready to unleash a storm. "You will leave her," Juan Pablo declared, his voice steely with resolve. "You will leave my daughter, and you will never come near her again. Do you understand me?" Esteban, cowed by the force of Juan Pablo's presence, nodded mutely, his bravado completely stripped away. He could see that this was not a battle he could win, not against a father whose love for his daughter had been betrayed so deeply. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 3 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Juan Pablo's eyes bore into Esteban's, making sure that the message was clear and that there would be no misunderstanding. "If you ever lay a hand on her again, if you so much as speak her name, I will make sure you regret it for the rest of your life." With those final words, Juan Pablo turned and walked away, leaving Esteban standing alone in the middle of the bar, his glass of liquor forgotten on the table. The patrons, still stunned into silence, watched as Juan Pablo exited the bar, the wooden doors swinging shut behind him with a finality that echoed through the room. As Juan Pablo stepped back into the night, the cool air did little to calm the fire that still burned within him, but he knew he had done what was necessary. He had made it clear that no one would ever harm his daughter again, not while he still drew breath. And with that thought, he made his way back home, back to Rosalinda, determined to rebuild the peace that Esteban had shattered. That was the last word Esteban managed to utter before a powerful punch from Juan Pablo landed squarely on his face, sending him crashing to the floor. The force of the blow knocked the glass from Esteban's hand, spilling its contents and plunging the once lively bar into a stunned silence. Esteban, shocked and disoriented, struggled to comprehend what had just happened. What he mumbled, his hand instinctively reaching for the spot where Juan Pablo's fist had connected. But Juan Pablo had no intention of giving him time to recover. With a grim determination, he grabbed Esteban by the collar of his shirt, lifting him effortlessly before driving his fist into Esteban's stomach. The blow forced the air from Esteban's lungs in a painful gasp, his body doubling over as he groaned in agony. The patrons of the bar, frozen in place, watched the scene unfold with bated breath, too stunned or too afraid to intervene. Only one man, a friend of Esteban's who had been sitting at a nearby table, found the courage to stand. He was of medium build, and though he seemed hesitant, he appeared ready to jump into the fray. "Don't get involved," Juan Pablo warned, his voice cold and commanding as he shot the man a look that left no room for doubt. The threat in his eyes was clear. This was between him and Esteban, and anyone who tried to interfere would regret it. Ignoring the warning, the friend stepped forward, reaching out to grab Juan Pablo's arm, but he was met with a swift, brutal shove that sent him sprawling to the ground. The ease with which Juan Pablo dispatched him sent a clear message: nothing would stand in his way. The man, now sprawled on the floor, wisely decided to stay down, his bravado evaporating in the face of Juan Pablo's rage. With his path unobstructed, Juan Pablo turned his full attention back to Esteban, who was still reeling from the second blow. The young man's bravado had vanished, replaced by a dazed confusion as he tried to regain his footing. But Juan Pablo was relentless. He seized Esteban by the shoulders and slammed him against the wall, the impact sending shockwaves through the room. Each time he spoke, his words were punctuated by another vicious strike, his voice ringing with fury that echoed in the silence of the bar. "How dare you lay a hand on my daughter?" Juan Pablo roared, his voice a mix of wrath and anguish. "She is everything to me, and you..." He slammed Esteban into the wall again, harder this time, causing a pained gasp to escape from the younger man. "You think you can hurt her and walk away unscathed? Do you think you can treat her like this and get away with it?" With each accusation, Juan Pablo's blows grew more forceful, his anger manifesting in the violence he unleashed on Esteban. The once confident young man, who had moments before been laughing with his friends, now found himself on the receiving end of a father's unbridled rage. Fear flickered in Esteban's eyes, replacing the smug smile he had worn so arrogantly. He realized, too late, the depth of the mistake he had made. Juan Pablo's grip tightened on Esteban's shoulders, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper, his fury boiling just beneath the surface. "If you ever touch her again, if you even think about hurting her, I swear there won't be a place on this earth where you can hide from me. Do you understand?" His teeth were clenched, each word dripping with the promise of retribution, a threat that hung heavy in the air. With a final, brutal punch to Esteban's stomach, Juan Pablo let him go, watching as the younger man crumpled to the ground, clutching his midsection and gasping for breath. The bar was deathly quiet, the only sound the ragged breathing of Esteban as he lay at Juan Pablo's feet, beaten and broken. The fury that had driven Juan Pablo was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but he forced himself to step back, knowing that he had made his point. The tension was shattered when the bar's owners, finally shaken from their shock, rushed forward to intervene. They stepped between the two men, their hands raised in a gesture of peace as they urged Juan Pablo to step back, while another helped Esteban to his feet. "This has gone too far," one of the owners shouted, his voice trembling with both fear and authority. The other patrons, who had watched the violence unfold in stunned silence, began to murmur amongst themselves, some nodding in agreement, others still too shocked to react. The second bar owner, realizing the severity of the situation and the state Esteban was in, quickly pulled out his phone and dialed the police. "This won't end here," he muttered into the phone, his voice thick with tension as he reported the incident. His words carried an ominous weight, a promise that the violence that had erupted would have lasting consequences. As the call ended, he glanced at Juan Pablo, a mix of fear and respect in his eyes, aware that the arrival of the authorities would only escalate the situation. Juan Pablo, breathing heavily, looked around at the faces watching him, some filled with shock, others with a grim understanding. He knew that what he had done was extreme, but in his heart, he felt it was justified. He had defended his daughter and had made it clear that no one would hurt her without facing the consequences. And yet, as the reality of what had just transpired settled over him, the weight of his actions began to press down on him. But one thing was certain in his mind: Esteban would never harm Rosalinda again. As the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, Juan Pablo took one last look at Esteban, who now stood leaning against the wall, defeated and broken. "Remember what I said," Juan Pablo growled, his voice low and full of warning. "If you value your life, you'll stay far away from Rosalinda." With that, Juan Pablo turned and walked out of the bar, the cool night air hitting his face as he stepped into the darkness. The adrenaline still coursed through his veins, but his mind was already turning back to Rosalinda, to the daughter who needed him now more than ever. As he walked away from the scene of the confrontation, he knew that whatever happened next, he would face it with the same determination and love that had driven him to protect his daughter at all costs. Esteban, now on his feet, breathing heavily and visibly shaken, cast a glance at Juan Pablo, a mixture of fear and simmering hatred in his eyes. But he remained silent, knowing full well that any word could rekindle the wrath that had already left him battered. The tension in the bar was thick, the silence deafening as everyone waited for what would happen next. Juan Pablo stood rigid, his chest rising and falling with deep breaths as he fought to rein in the anger, still coursing through his veins. He was aware that the police would soon arrive, but that was of little consequence to him. His only concern was that Esteban understood the message loud and clear: he would never hurt Rosalinda again without facing dire consequences. The arrival of the police marked a turning point in the already tense atmosphere. The officers entered the bar, immediately sensing the gravity of the situation. Juan Pablo and Esteban were still at opposite ends of the room, both marked by the altercation but for very different reasons. Esteban, still visibly frightened, kept his gaze low, while Juan Pablo, though struggling to contain his emotions, stood tall, his demeanor unyielding. The officers quickly assessed the scene, recognizing that this was far from a typical bar fight. They moved swiftly to separate the men, placing handcuffs on Juan Pablo, Esteban, and even Esteban's friend, who had tried unsuccessfully to intervene. The bar patrons watched in stunned silence as the three men were escorted out to the waiting patrol cars. No one spoke. The gravity of what had unfolded kept them mute. Juan Pablo offered no resistance as the officers guided him into the car. He was fully aware that his actions carried legal consequences, but in his heart he knew he had done what was necessary to protect his daughter. That, above all else, was his unwavering priority. At the police station, the three men were led to separate interrogation rooms, each one isolated to ensure their stories could be heard without interference. Juan Pablo sat in an uncomfortable chair, his mind far from the sterile, cold room in which he found himself. All he could think about was Rosalinda, how she was, how she would feel once she learned where he was. He knew that the police would eventually call her in to provide her side of the story, and the thought filled him with both concern and a measure of relief. His concern stemmed from the knowledge that she would have to relive the painful events that had brought them to this point. But there was also relief in knowing that the truth, long buried under fear and silence, would finally be revealed. It wasn't long before Rosalinda was brought to the station. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her expression one of exhaustion, but there was a newfound resolve in the way she carried herself. She understood that this was her moment to speak up, to shed light on what had been happening behind closed doors since Esteban had begun to change. During the interrogation, Rosalinda spoke haltingly at first, her voice wavering under the weight of her emotions. But as she continued, her words grew stronger, her resolve clearer. She recounted how the marriage, once full of hope and promise, had slowly unraveled. He started drinking more and more, she began, her voice trembling as she recalled the early signs of trouble. And with the drinking came the anger. He would snap at me for the smallest things, and when I tried to talk to him about it, he became even more aggressive. Tears filled her eyes as she described the events that had led to the confrontation. "Yesterday," she said, her voice breaking, "I asked him not to go out. I just wanted us to spend some time together, but he got furious. He yelled at me and said I had no right to tell him what to do. When I tried to calm him down, he pushed me against the wall, and then he hit me." The words hung in the air, heavy with the pain and fear she had been carrying alone. Yet, as difficult as it was to recount, there was also a sense of release in finally bringing it to light. Rosalinda went on to explain how, after the attack, Esteban had left her alone, bruised and terrified, with no idea of when he would return. "I didn't know what to do," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I started cleaning. I thought if I could make everything look normal, maybe I could feel normal again. But I couldn't. I was too scared." Meanwhile, in a separate room, Juan Pablo sat waiting for his interrogation. He knew he would have to answer for what he had done, but as he sat there, his thoughts remained with Rosalinda. He knew he had acted on impulse, driven by a father's instinct to protect his child at all costs. But as he reflected on the events that had led him here, he felt no regret. What he had done out of love and the fierce determination to ensure that no one would ever hurt his daughter again. Finally, Juan Pablo was called in for questioning. As he walked into the room, he braced himself, knowing that he would have to relive the violence of the night and justify his actions. But as he sat down, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. He knew that the truth was on his side, and more importantly, that he had done what was necessary to protect his family. No matter what came next, he would face it with the same strength and resolve that had guided him to this moment. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 4 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. When Juan Pablo was finally called into the interrogation room, he recounted the events at the bar with a steady voice, detailing the anger and pain that had driven him to confront Esteban with such violence. He spoke of the betrayal he felt upon discovering that the man he had trusted with his daughter's happiness had instead become the source of her suffering. His words were charged with the fierce love of a father who had been pushed to his limits. Esteban, when his turn came, attempted to justify his actions, but his explanations rang hollow, especially in light of the undeniable evidence and Rosalinda's powerful testimony. The weight of her words, her bravery in speaking out, left little room for doubt about where the blame truly lay. Esteban's friend, who had tried to intervene during the fight, was questioned as well. However, his involvement was minimal, and after providing his statement, he was released. The hours dragged on as the officers pieced together the full story, cross-referencing accounts, and determining the severity of each person's actions. When all was said and done, the officers allowed Rosalinda to post bail for her father, enabling Juan Pablo to be released while the investigation continued. Esteban, on the other hand, faced more serious charges due to his assault on Rosalinda, and the consequences he would face were far from light. As Juan Pablo stepped out of the police station, he was greeted by the sight of Rosalinda waiting for him at the entrance, her face a mixture of relief and determination. The moment she saw him, she rushed forward, throwing her arms around him in a tight embrace. For the first time in what felt like ages, she felt safe. "Dad," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil she had endured, "I can't live like this anymore. I'm going to file for divorce. I don't want to be afraid anymore. I want to start over, but I need you by my side." Juan Pablo, though still processing everything that had transpired, felt a surge of pride for his daughter's courage. He held her close, his voice firm as he replied, "I am here for you, Rosalinda. I always will be. We'll get through this together, no matter what." His words were not just a promise, but a vow, a commitment to stand by her side as she rebuilt her life. The two of them left the police station, the weight of the night's events beginning to lift as they walked toward the familiar comfort of home. They returned to the house where Rosalinda had grown up, a place that had always been a sanctuary of love and safety. For Rosalinda, stepping back into her childhood home was like finding refuge after being lost in a storm. It was a place where she could finally feel secure, far away from the shadows of fear that had haunted her for so long. With Esteban now out of her life, having been ordered by the police to leave town and stay away, Rosalinda began to see a path forward. The divorce proceedings were swift, and once finalized, the house she had shared with Esteban was sold. The proceeds were divided, and Rosalinda used her share to start anew. She invested in small projects that had always been her dream, channeling her energy into building something of her own, a new source of income, and more importantly, a renewed sense of purpose in the town she called home. With Juan Pablo's unwavering support, Rosalinda felt a newfound confidence. She no longer had to look over her shoulder or live in fear of what the next day might bring. Instead, she embraced the possibilities of the future, knowing that the worst was behind her. Life gradually settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. The days became calmer and more predictable, and in that stability, Rosalinda found solace. The presence of her father was a constant source of strength. His love and his protective nature reminded her daily that family, above all, was indestructible. The wounds left by Esteban's betrayal began to heal, and the house, once again filled with laughter and light, became a home in the truest sense of the word. Together, Juan Pablo and Rosalinda rebuilt their lives, finding joy in the simple moments, in the quiet assurance that they could face any challenge the future might hold. And so, as time passed, Rosalinda moved forward with her life, her steps no longer weighed down by fear or uncertainty. She knew that whatever came next, she would face it with the strength she had discovered within herself and the unbreakable bond she shared with her father. Juan Pablo's home remained a place of refuge, a symbol of the enduring love that had carried them through the darkest of times. No matter what the future held, Rosalinda knew that she would always have a place to call home, and a father who would protect her with every ounce of strength he possessed. As we close this chapter in Rosalinda and Juan Pablo's journey, we're reminded of the profound strength that comes from love, courage, and unwavering support. What have you learned from their story? How does it inspire you to act with bravery, protect those you care about, or stand firm in your values? Please take a moment to reflect and share in the comments below one thing you've learned from this story that you'll bring into practice in your own life. If you found this video meaningful, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you stories that touch the heart and inspire change.